Across Africa and within the different regions, entrepreneurs and investors face a regulatory environment that is less than business-friendly when compared to developed economies. Ideally, the regulatory environment should be used as a tool to make the formal sector more accessible to anyone with a good idea and a passion for growing their business.
Africa presents an abundance of opportunities to the world. It is said by many that it is the obvious choice for investment. However, a supportive regulatory framework is crucial in ensuring that doing business in Africa can be done with ease. According to a recent report by the World Bank, there are 10 areas of business regulations that will determine how easy or how difficult it is to operate in a country. Amongst some of the key areas is the process of establishing a business, resolving insolvencies, cross-border trading, and the accessibility to electricity. Mauritius, followed by South Africa and Rwanda, were identified as the top-ranking countries in Africa to operate based on their regulatory framework. However, countries such as Chad, Congo, and Angola are still playing catch-up in establishing business-friendly environments.
Certainly things are improving right across the continent. Where they're not improving, it's because there has been, say, civil disturbance and that sort of thing. So in North Africa, things are a little bit unstable at the moment. So one would be looking a little more carefully under those circumstances. Where you have changes of regime, often just for the hell of it, they change this and change that was put in place by the previous fellows. But on the whole, I think it's true to say that things are getting better for the investors across Africa.
Morocco is an example of how regulatory reforms in construction permits, tax compliance, and administration has leapfrogged the country ahead of some of its African counterparts. The African continent has seen large capital outlays in the ICT sector. Broadband through WACS is one example, but with the changing face of technology and its ability to act as a catalyst for economic growth, clear and consistent guidelines are necessary.
If there was no good regulatory environment, we wouldn't be talking about 1 billion mobile phones today in the African continent, where there's a biggest problem or hurdle or bottleneck is in space. As African operators, as African players in the ICT sector, we do not have access to orbital slots. 2, we do not have access to most of the space-related frequencies for us to be able to build our own satellites and run our own satellite networks, right? And be able to provide services via satellites and connect those satellite services together. The main regulatory problem is for us as Africa, both regulators, players, operators, infrastructure builders, investors at Africa, all of them to be able to speak with one voice.
Africa has seen an inflow of foreign direct investment projects, some in the form of private equity, and a lax stance on these policies regarding the acquisition of the land has also had a spillover effect on the social aspect.
The one pertinent thing in the ag business sector is the whole issue of ownership of land, which forms the basis for you to finance your activity. As you know, more than 90% of production in Africa comes from communal farming, where the farmer isn't the land owner. And of course that causes a lot of problems with financing his product. Why would you put up a building or a factory or whatever if it's not your land?
It should be noted that the enforcement of regulatory policies and reforms should be taken into account when these policies are formulated. And today it is the economies that apply a holistic approach in the aim of making policy regulations accessible, transparent, and independent.
Now joining me in studio to give us their views on the regulatory landscape in Africa, Daniel Kinnear, Senior Executive Associate, Africa Strategy Group, Michael Fortmann, Associate Director, KPMG, and Sebastien Thouvenot, he's the Executive at Edward Nathan Sonnenbergs Africa. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. When we talk about regulation, as has already been set up, what would you say, Daniel, is the key challenge that companies are facing across the continent?
Well, I think in Africa in particular, I think one thing we've got to understand, in a regulated environment, it allows business to do business knowing the rules. When there's no regulation, then there's who you know and how do you get those deals made. So in a sense, having the right regulation in partnership with business and understanding them, their needs, that way you can create an environment where everyone wins. But in an absence of a regulation or an excess of regulation, they're both counterproductive to actually driving the economies in certain of these countries.
Michael, perhaps let me rephrase that and say, is there enough regulation when it comes to the continent?
I think that there is. You know, there's a lot of regulation, but I think that the one issue that we find quite disturbing, I suppose, from a practical point of view is there's the regulation and there's legislation. But when it comes to practice and applying that, is it followed? Do they apply it in the same way as it's written, I suppose? And we often find there's a disconnect from what's written in the books as to the way governments actually apply it.
I see, Sebastien, you wanting to concur with that, concur with that statement.
Yes, I agree. There is enough regulation. If I can speak for Francophone Africa, the business law is really sophisticated. But the problem is the application of this law, and especially the settlement of disputes, for instance. And then when you go and see a tribunal, then you can have problems.
So how do we improve the application, in your opinion? Let's look for solutions here. Can you elaborate on improving the application, especially in Francophone territories?
There are many factors, but improvement could go through having recourse to arbitration more and more, just to avoid local jurisdiction. And then the main issue is the corruption. So.
And it's going to take some some time to wield out the corruption, isn't it, Daniel?
Yeah, and I think often we throw in the towel because of corruption when we've got to combat it and strengthen the institutions. I think the laws are great. The scope of the legislation and what it wants to serve is great. The problem is there's no institutional capacity, and the interference of politicians and politics once the legislation is in place. Even when countries are signatories to OPIC and MEGR, they still breach that. And then if you go to arbitration, as you were referring to, it's a costly process and often bad for the reputation of either the business or the country.
So the bottom line, the regulators don't have teeth, so to speak.
Well, I think that they don't apply their rules correctly, maybe not with the just cause, like you say, obviously corruption. But I think with something like as soon as governments become more transparent and the citizens can see exactly what they're providing, you know, what they're doing on the ground with administration, those kind of things, then I do think you'll get more of a buy-in from companies and from governments, and obviously that will also weed out the corruption to a certain extent.
Are there more sectors, or are there some sectors that are better regulated than others?
Yeah, if I can speak for West and Central Africa, you have an organization called OADA. This is Organization for the Harmonization of Business Law in Africa. And this is a unique experience because 16 African states are members of this organization. And this is the same law for all these countries. And it goes from business, company law to insolvency law to security law. They have all the same rules. So this is a very sophisticated legislation.
And has it made a difference in those 17 countries, Sebastien?
Difference between? No, there is no difference.
No, I'm saying, has it made a difference to operating in that regime? Now that there is consistency, it's working.
Yeah, the problem is how the law is applied. So there are differences between countries, but the strength of this organization is that there is a higher court who sits in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, and then this court has to harmonize the jurisprudence relating to these uniform acts. So there is a unique interpretation of law.
And isn't that what we should have more of then? Perhaps not just 17 countries falling under that ambit, but the whole continent.
Great, I think Sebastien is correct. You know, the greater amount of harmonization we have, the more we can enable Africans to drive the economic development of the continent. At the moment, it sits in silos. And if the only strength of any regulatory process is having the option of arbitration, that should be seen as almost the last but necessary insurance that it works. What it should do is encourage trade, and we know that that is the biggest deficient, along with infrastructure.
If we talk about sectors, trade and infrastructure being the two biggest concerns, let's put it that way, are we seeing forces moving to radically improve regulation in that space, in those two particular sectors?
I think there has been a change. I think, as we said, you know, as soon as harmonization comes in, try and get common ground, it does help. But I still think there needs to be a lot more improvement within those two sectors, I think especially within the African continent, for the regulatory position should change.
How long is it going to take before we have harmonization? And I see this Sebastien looking at Daniel. Daniel, get out your crystal ball, gentlemen. Come, let's put some numbers down on the table. Daniel, this is coming back to you. Yeah,
well, very briefly, I think there's attempts by creating regional trade bodies, for example, the COMESAs, the SADCs, the SACUs, the ECOWASs, the ECAs.
Maghreb Union.
Yes, and there's this multiplication, which is going to complicate it yet rather than enabling it.
So it's duplicity, effectively.
It is you're absolutely right, it's duplicity, and in some cases just failure to put in, build confidence around the institutions that are there to regulate, to arbitrate, and as you touched on at the outset, the legislation that frames it in law. And I think that's one of the issues we have.
Fewer communities then, would that be a good starting point?
Yes, it could be, especially in the southern part of Africa, because main countries are sometimes part of several organizations of that. So COMESA, SADC.
East African Community.
Yes, East African Community, South African Community, Union. These are all, they have all the same purpose. So.
But now, who is going to drive change when it comes to integrating or combining? And this is coming clearly to you, and I can see everyone's not wanting to answer this question. Is somebody going to take a stance on this, Michael?
Somebody needs to. It depends at the end of the day who's going to put their hand up and start driving it. I think if we look at a lot of the projects, they're looking at either Southern Africa, South Africa. East Africa is obviously also a big driving point at the moment. But it means these jurisdictions getting together with a combined purpose and actually all putting their heads together and obviously trying to resolve these situations.
Well, it's goodbye to Daniel Kinnear and Sebastien Thouvenot. We're going to a quick commercial break and we'll be taking a closer look at tax regulation when we return. Don't go anywhere.